Some daughters are their father's pride, but I was just a reminder that I wasn't my brother. I don't remember a single day of my childhood when I wasn't compared to my brother. From the moment I could understand words, my father's voice carried the same refrain. Why can't you be more like him? Those words clung to me, branding themselves into my skin, reshaping how I saw myself. To my father, my brother wasn't just his son. He was his pride, his masterpiece, his legacy in human form. And me? I was a shadow, the one who blended into the background while the spotlight burned bright on him. From the outside, we looked like the perfect family. My father, a man respected in our community, always carrying his quiet woman who, my brother, the golden child, to the way he charmed. And then there was me, the daughter who tried to shine. It wasn't just the favorite, it was the injustice. I worked harder than anyone, studied longer, pushed myself just to earn crumbs of ignorance. When I brought home a perfect report card, my father nodded absently. Good. Before turning to gush about my brother's latest basketball, when I performed in the school play, dressed in costume and trembling he congratulated my brother instead for scoring a winning goal that same weekend. My achievements were always invisible, erased by his obsession with elevating that favoritism. I still remember one Christmas when my father handed my brother a brand new bike, shining red and polished like a jewel under the whole family clapped as he wheeled it around. Got a sweater, a plain itchy, wrapped hastily, no sparkle, no pride. It's practical, my father said. That was his word. My brother got dreams. I got practice. Even as a child, at best, they would pat my head, not just at them. That anger, my father didn't tolerate anger. If I so much as my eyes, he would accuse me of being disrespectful, of being jealous. So I buried it, swallowed it, let it eat at me from the inside. Nights were the hardest. I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the day's humiliations, imagining what it would feel like to have my father look at me with the same pride he reserved for my brother. The fantasy always ended the same way, with me waking up, realizing it would never happen. But anger has a way of transforming into suspicion. Over time, I began to notice patterns, tiny cracks in the perfect image my father projected. The way he overcompensated with my brother, showering him with attention almost as if to prove something. The way he avoided talking about certain parts of my brother's childhood, brushing past questions with vague answers. At first, I thought I was imagining it, desperate to find flaws where none existed. But once you start seeing the inconsistencies, it's impossible to unsee them. Suspense became part of my everyday life. I found myself watching my father more closely, analyzing his words, his reaction, searching for meaning in the smallest gestures. Why did he tense up when people commented on how different my brother looked from? Why did my mother flinch when certain relatives asked about the year my brother was born? Why did conversations shift so abruptly whenever I asked? I didn't have answers. Questions that kept the shock, though, a single brutal moment. It happened at school, of all, an environment where I had worked tirelessly on a science project, pouring weeks of. I painted each planet by hand, researched details, stayed up late night. The day of the presentation, my teacher beamed at me, telling me how impressed she was. For once, I felt proud, confident, seen. But then my father arrived. He had promised to come see my project, and for a fleeting moment, my heart swelled. Maybe this time he would finally notice me. Maybe this time he would see my worth. He walked in, glanced at my project with barely a nod, then turned his full attention to my brother, who had tagged along. "Did you tell your teacher about the basketball championship?" he asked loudly, puffing his chest with pride. The teacher, caught off guard, congratulated my brother, and just like that, my solar system disappeared into the background. The humiliation was unbearable. My classmates watched, whispering, their eyes flicking between me and my father as if waiting for me, but I couldn't. My throat closed up, my hands shook, my face burned. I stood there, my pride crumpling, while my brother basked in the spotlight. That should have been mine. When the bell rang, I packed up my project silently, fighting tears, my shame suffocating me. That was the day I realized the favoritism wasn't just private. It was public. My father wasn't ashamed of dismissing me. He wanted the world to see who he valued and who he didn't. That shame followed me home, seeping into every corner of my being. I replayed the scene again and again, each time cutting deeper, each time reminding me that I was invisible, that I would never measure up. But somewhere beneath the shame, a seed of vindication began to sprout. Because in that moment of devastation, I saw something I hadn't noticed before, the desperation in my father's pride. It wasn't just love for my brother. It was obsession. The kind of obsession that I didn't understand it yet, but I knew one thing. The story wasn't as simple as it. That realization, my shame didn't disappear. It clung to me, but now it had come. Suspicion. A whisper in the back of my mind telling me that the pedestal my brother stood on wasn't built of. It was built of lies. And one day, though I didn't know how, and that knowledge, faint but undeniable, was my first taste. I thought my humiliation but the real blow was still waiting, hidden in a secret I was never supposed. To my father, my brother wasn't just, he was the sun, and the rest of us revolved around. By the time I reached my teenage years, the favoritism wasn't just a whisper in my, it was a full-blown anthem, one that everyone around us knew. My brother wasn't simply a shining star, a living embodiment, and while my father polished my brother's image like a prized trophy, I stood in the shadow. To my father, my brother could do no wrong. If he scored 10 points in a basketball game, my father declared him a future NBA star, retelling the story to anyone who would listen. If he aced a math test, my father said he was destined to become a doctor or a genius in the. If he smiled at a neighbor, my father proclaimed him the most charming. And when my brother failed, and yes, he did fail, it was never his fault. A teacher was, a referee was, the world, not my brother. That image wasn't confined. Relative, they all joined at family reunions, calling him the. Aunts fawned over him, how proud his father. At school, teachers pointed to him as the standard everyone. And me? Being compared. Why can't you be more like him? The question followed me everywhere, from relatives when I earned a B instead of an A, from teachers when I stumbled through a presentation, from neighbors when I tripped over my bike. Each comparison wasn't just a reminder of my shortcomings, it was an erasure of my identity. I wasn't seen as me. I was always measured against him and always found lacking. The injustice burned deep. I tried to carve out spaces for myself, places where I could shine without his shadow smothering me. I joined the school choir, practicing for weeks to earn a solo. When the night of the concert arrived, I sang my heart out, the spotlight warm on my face, the applause filling the auditorium. For once, I felt like I mattered. But when I stepped off stage, flushed with pride, my father leaned down and whispered, "That was fine. But your brother just told me he might be captain of the basketball team." My triumph vanished in an instant, replaced by the sting of invisibility, the humiliation of those moments stacked like bricks on my holidays, birthdays. No event was safe. I still remember my sixth. I had begged for a week to celebrate with friends. But before I even blew out the candle, let's all raise a glass to my son, who's got accepted into. The cheers that followed drowned out. My cake became background noise. One year, he unwrapped it, glanced at it, muttered a quick thank, and turned to my brother, who received a pair of. Now this is a real gift. Perfect for it. The word champion years long after the graduation, the one day men were hijacked. When I graduated middle school, my father shook my then launched into a story about how my brother's coach said he might have called. Even on a day meant for me, my spotlight was my worth dismissed. Anger festered in me like a slow burning fire. I wanted to scream, to throw his words back at him, to demand that but every time I showed even a flicker of anger, "You're just bitter, because you'll never be like." The cruelty wasn't just in the favoritism, it was in the denial of my right to feel, my right to be angry at the injustice. I swallowed my rage, but it never went away. It sat in my chest, heavy and sharp, cutting me from the inside. And with the anger came suspicion. Why was my father so obsessed with my brother's success? It wasn't normal. Not this level of praise, not this blindness to flaws. It was more than pride. It was desperation. The way my father clung to my brother's achievements felt less like love and more like survival, as if my brother's image was the only thing holding my father together. The thought unsettled me, but I pushed it away, telling myself I was overanalyzing. Still, the suspicion lingered, a whisper I couldn't silence. Suspense began to weave itself into my. I found myself watching my father's actions closely, noticing how his eyes lit up at every mention of my brother, how his shoulders squared with pride how his voice thundered with, "This wasn't normal. This wasn't just." And obsessions always have cracks. The shock came one evening during what should have been the table was set, my mother had cooked, and for once, I hoped we might. I had gotten an award at school that day. Nothing huge, but enough to make me proud. A certificate for outstanding effort in English, given by a teacher who told me I had a gift for storytelling. I clutched the paper in my hands, waiting for the right moment to share it, craving just a sliver of recognition. But when I mentioned it, my father barely glanced. He muttered. Then, without missing a beat, He launched into a loud, glowing, "Did you all hear? He scored 20 points at his. The coach says he's the best player." Everyone turned to my brother, showering him with, but the worst part, his voice carried, "Maybe if you spent less time with your silly hobby." The table went silent. My mother lowered her. My brother smirked. My relatives shifted. I sat frozen. The words cutting. Public humiliation served to me on a plate in front of the very people I spent years trying. And in that moment, something shifted and the shame was suffocating. But beneath it was a spark of defiance, of vindication waiting. Because as much as my father wanted to erase me, I knew deep down that the cracks in his story would one day reveal themselves. He could humiliate me all he wanted, but the truth he was so desperate to bury, was waiting to be unearthed. That family dinner was the breaking point, the moment I realized the humiliation would never stop. But I had no idea that the very obsession my father worshipped in my brother would one day become his downfall. There's only so much silence a heart can hold before it cracks. That family dinner, the one where my father used my achievement as a springboard to praise my brother while tearing me down in front of everyone, became a turning point I couldn't ignore. It wasn't the first time he had humiliated me publicly, but something about the way his words cut across the table, the way the air went silent, the way my brother smirked like he had won a prize, it broke something inside. I had always swallowed the pain, always told myself, but after that night, I went to my room after shutting the door. The tears came hard, soaking my shred of dignity of the people I wanted, as if For days afterward, I bottled up. I started writing in my diary late at night, word onto paper, page filled with sentences I couldn't say. Why doesn't he love me? Why am I never enough? Why do I feel like I'm not even? My pen scratched, but still, the words weren't enough. Those diary entries, they were the only. I wasn't drowned out, but even there, shameful. I felt weak for crying. It was a vicious hurt, right? My diary became both my life. My friends began to note. They had always been aware of the favoritism, though no one ever dared to comment directly. At birthday parties, they watched and saw him beam with pride. Share something of my own. One afternoon, my best friend pulled me aside. "I don't get it," she whispered, her eyes full of sympathy. "You're amazing. You work so hard. Why can't he see it?" Her words should have comforted me, but instead they made me feel worse. Because if even outsiders could see the imbalance, then the cruelty wasn't in my head. It was real. And that reality was unbearable. The injustice of it all grew sharper every time I saw my father interact with my brother. He never missed a game, never forgot a detail of his. He retold my brother's stories with pride swelling in his chest. But with me, he forgot. Forgot my recitals, forgot my awards, forgot my birthdays until my mother reminded him. The message was clear. My existence wasn't enough to earn his attention unless I was serving as the highlight. My brother. Humiliation became a constant. I stopped sharing, tired of watching her. Worse, his mouth twisted. It hurt too much to see. Shrinking myself smaller and silence wasn't protected. Anger, how I slammed doors when I picked fights over, snapped at my. She tried to comfort. It wasn't fair to her, but I didn't know where else about telling him. But the words always died on my lips. He had a way of making me feel small before, as if my voice would never carry. Still, with the anger came suspicion. My father's obsession with my brother wasn't just favoritism, it was extreme. He clung to my brother's every movement with desperation. I began to wonder, noting how quickly his tone shifted when it was as if his pride in my brother was of but performance. And if it was a performance, then what was the truth? The shock came in a moment. One evening, I walked past the living room. His voice was low, nothing like the booming tone. "Brother." I paused in the hallway, my heart pounding, as his words floated through the doorway. "She's not like him. She'll never be like him. And maybe that's for the best. If she knew the truth, everything would fall apart." I froze. My body went cold, my breath caught in my throat. If she knew the truth. The words echoed in my mind like a siren. He wasn't just dismissing me. He was hiding something about me, something that made him keep me in the shadows. Shame washed over me, not because of his words, because of what they implied. For years I had carried the weight of not being enough, of believing I was unworthy of his. But now, a darker possibility. What if the problem wasn't? What if it was a secret he was desperate to keep hidden? Vindication flickered faintly in my chest, though it was tainted. His words weren't the end. For the first time, my father's obsession, his cruelty toward me, his endless comparison, they weren't just favoritism. They were a cover. And the truth behind that cover might be bigger than anything I had ever imagined. That night, as I lay awake staring at the ceiling, his words replayed in my mind. If she knew the truth, everything would fall apart. I didn't know what the truth was, but I knew one thing for sometimes the truth doesn't whisper, it slips out by accident. After that night, when I overheard my father say, if she knew the truth, everything would fall apart, something inside me shifted permanently. I couldn't unhear those words. They wrapped around me like chains, heavy and unrelenting, binding me to a mystery I hadn't even known existed until then. For years, I had believed my pain was the result of favoritism, of being the unwanted daughter in a house where my brother was celebrated like a king. But now, there was a deeper possibility. Maybe it wasn't just neglect or bias. Maybe there was something they were hiding, a truth too dangerous to let. The days that followed were filled with tension. I tried to act normal, but every time I looked at my father, his favoritism suddenly felt for my brother and more like desperation. It was as if my brother's image wasn't just a source of pride or protection. The injustice of it gnawed at me. All my life I thought it was because I was weaker. But if there was a secret, if my father was intent. I thought back to the family dinner. Each one hurt, but now they looked. If I was humiliated, I had ignored before. Stories about never seemed to line up. My father told people my brother took his steps at 9 months, but my mother swore it was to a year. At one gathering, my grandmother laughed about, but later that same evening, predictions were small, but together they. The more I listened, my mother, usually quiet in family, grew especially uncomfortable. I tried casually bringing it up. Did I visit him when he was a baby? She froze, her fork hovering midair, her eyes darting to my father. He didn't miss a beat, launching into one of his exaggerated stories about how strong and perfect my brother had been from. My mother didn't say another word. That silence spoke louder than any answer. I started going through old photo albums, flipping through yellowed pages late at night when no one else was around. At first glance, they looked normal. Birthday parties, holiday gatherings, school portraits. But the more I studied them, the more I noticed oddities. My brother's baby photos looked out of place, almost as though they didn't belong to the same timeline as mine. Dates written in the margins contradicted the stories I had been told. In one album, there was a Christmas picture labeled 1999, where my brother looked at least 2 years old, even though my father had always sworn he was born in another, a birthday cake number 3 on it, but the caption claimed it was his second birthday. The inconsistencies piled up like puzzle pieces, and every time I tried to ask, I was met with silence, or worse. My father dismissed my question, while my mother shifted their reactions only. Suspense became. I woke up every morning, went to bed with them. Was my brother really my father? Was there something? The shock hit me. Their voices were low but tense. We've kept it this long. She doesn't need to. My mother responded. But what if she finds out on her own? That was all I heard before, but it was enough to send me spiraling. She doesn't need to know. Who was the she? And what exactly did? Shame crept in again, but this time it wasn't about. It was about the possibility that I felt foolish, humiliated, all those times I had. But what if it had never been about me? What if I had been carrying? And yet, from beneath that shame came the stirrings of, if they were hiding something, it was the result of. It was proof that I had right all along. Something was wrong in this. Something they were desperate to keep buried. Every silence, every inconsistency, every harsh word from my father wasn't just cruelty. It was defense. He wasn't protecting me. He was protecting himself and my brother and a secret that threatened to destroy everything. The final crack came at a family gathering a few weeks later. We were sitting in my aunt's living room, surrounded by cousins and relatives, when the conversation turned to childhood memories. Someone laughed about how mischievous my brother had been as a climbing onto counters and getting into trouble. My aunt chuckled and shook her head, then said, almost absent-mindedly, well, that's the truth behind your brother. The room went silent for a moment, and I saw my mother stiffen instantly. My father shot my aunt a sharp look, the kind that could cut steel, and she quickly changed the subject, laughing a little too loudly about something else. But it was too late. The words had left. The truth behind your brother. My heart pounded as I sat frozen in my, trying to keep my expression neutral while my mind. What truth? What had she almost revealed? And why did my parents react like that? As if a bomb had been dropped in the middle. That night, I could. My aunt slipped, louder than anywhere, heavier than the truth behind. I didn't know what it was. Families don't bury secrets. They whisper them until. After my aunt slipped those words, the truth behind your brother, I became someone else entirely. I couldn't let it go. I smiled through the rest of the gathering, nodding politely, laughing at jokes, pretending I hadn't heard the sentence that changed everything. But inside, I was spiraling, the way my father's jaw tight. the way my mother stiffened, the way my aunt practically swallowed her tongue. It wasn't just a casual mistake. It was a leak, a fracture, a signal that whispers had always existed, but I'd been too blind, too silenced, too distracted by my own pain. I spent the next days thinking about they weren't new to me. I had always felt them brushing past me, like never loud enough to catch the kind of whispers that leave you staring at people. Back then, I thought as celebrated, but now I wondered if they had the injustice of it clawed at me. I had spent my entire life being afterthought. And yet, beneath that polished image, whispers had been swirling. They had praised him in the open and doubted him in the shadows. Why hadn't I seen it? Why had I carried the shame of not being enough when maybe it wasn't me who was the problem at all? I began replaying moments I had ignored as a child. There was the time at a family barbecue when an older cousin laughed too hard after my father told a story about my brother's first step. I remembered her muttering under her breath, "If that's how you want to tell it, sure." I had been too young then to question it, but now the memory burned with new meaning. Or the time my grandmother looked at my brother for a long moment during a holiday dinner and, "Well, he is what he is." At the time I thought she was scolding him, but what if it had been something else? Humiliation took on a different shape. It wasn't just about me being pushed aside. It was about me being manipulated into silence while everyone else tiptoed around a truth they all. I was the last to understand the script, the outsider in a play that had been running for decades. I had cried into my pillow for years thinking I was unworthy, when in reality I had been shielded, or maybe distracted, from the fact that my brother's perfection wasn't what it seemed. Anger welled up like a tidal wave, not just at my father, though he remained at the center of my rage, but at all of them. Every relative who whispered but never spoke, every cousin who smirked but never explained, every adult who looked at me was compared to my brother but never told me why. They had let me suffer, had let me carry the humiliation while they traded whispers behind. It wasn't just favoritism anymore, it was complicity. The suspicion grew sharper by the day. I started watching closely at guests, testing my theory. I'd casually drop my brother's name, ask an innocent question about his childhood, and the pattern was undeniable. Some people grew tense. Others exchanged quick glances before giving vague hurt. My uncle once stammered so badly that my aunt heck I was circling the hidden in plain. I started hearing fragments. If only they told the truth. "You know, your family's not as perfect as they make it." I pressed her firmly. She clammed up instantly, her eyes darting away, and then came the sealed my suspicions. At a birthday party for one of the younger cousins, I overheard two aunts whispering in the kitchen. Their voices were low, but I caught enough to freeze me in place. "It's not her fault," one said. "She was just a child when it happened. But he'll never admit it." The other sighed and replied, "No, because then everything he built around the boy falls apart." My pulse pounded in my ears. The boy, my brother. They weren't talking about me. They were talking about him. I went home that night shaken to my core. Shame threatened to drown me again. Not the shame of being invisible this time, but the shame of realizing that everyone had known something. I felt stupid, foolish, humiliated all over it. But then I reminded myself, maybe they hadn't told me because they were afraid of what I would. Maybe they underestimated. And that thought lit a spark of vindication, because now I knew there was a secret and I was circling closer to it. My father's favoritism, my mother's silence, it was all connected. And if I had learned anything from it, was this. One evening, determined to find something, I pulled down a stack. Dust clung to my face as I flipped open the lid, sifting through photo albums. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, only that I'd know it when hours passed as I flipped through At first, a family trip, but then I noticed the date scribbled on the problem was, according to every story I'd been told, my brother wasn't even supposed to exist yet. And yet, there he was, standing there, unmistakably. My hands shook as I held my breath catching. This wasn't just a proof that something, and I had just uncovered. When no one will hand you, the photograph burned a hole, standing in that single photo. My chest ached, but I couldn't show it. If I revealed it to, would twist it, gaslight me, bury it under excuses. No, this was mine to guard, and mine to dig deeper into. But digging meant doing it alone. That realization hit me harder than I wanted to admit. I had no allies in this family. My friends might listen, but they hadn't lived through the silences, the contradictions, the carefully constructed wall of favoritism that protected my brother like a fortress. They would shake their heads, offer sympathy, maybe even doubt me. My mentor from school? My therapist? Number. This wasn't something to share until I had proof that screamed so loud no one could deny it. Until then, my suspicion was my burden, and my burden alone. I started sneaking back into the attic late at night, moving quiet. The boxes smelled of dust, and each one heavy. I would sit cross the yellow glow of and begin the slow, methodical. Every discovery favorited between brittle alp. Every photo seemed there. He was holding a trophy, standing and grinning at it. My father had labeled those photos, my photos by tucked into corner. It was as though even in the art, the injustice, he hadn't just favored he had rewritten reality, manufacturing perfect. My stomach twisted as he would go to me, and yet I couldn't look away. Some nights, the humiliation, I'd find letters from teachers praising my cards from relatives, and I'd remember how those same relatives had looked at me, their words for me always second, never full of my father had paraded him like a, and I had been the stable girl. Alone in the attic, tears stung my eyes, not just for the past, but for the years of belief. Humiliation turned in. What if everything had been staged? What if his entire identity had been built on? My hand shook as I flipped through albums. My jaw clenched as I sorted through. If they thought I would stay quiet. Suspicion sharpened as the inconsistencies multiplied. I found 2 birth announcements in different handwriting, with different dates scribbled in the margins. One card congratulated my parents in January. Another congratulated them in March of the same year. Which was it? Why 2? I found a school enrollment form where the age listed didn't match his supposed birthday. I found photos where he looked older than the story allowed. The more I uncovered, the more certain I became. The family timeline was fractured, and my father had spent years plastering over the cracks. The suspense nearly drove me mad. Each night I would crawl back into bed, my heart racing, my mind replaying every scrap of evidence. I'd lie awake staring at the ceiling, wondering if tomorrow I would find a piece. I imagined confronting my father with a stack of paper, forcing him to admit the truth. But every time I pictured it, heard his voice twisting reality, not without something he... And then came... It was a Saturday afternoon when I found it, a baptism record buried beneath a stack of old church bulletins. At first, I thought it was just another piece of ordinary family paperwork. But when I read the name, my heart stopped. It wasn't my brother's name listed. It was another, a name I had never heard before. Same date of birth, same family, different name. My breath caught in my throat as my eyes raced over the faded ink. What did it mean? A mistake? A clerical error? Or had my brother once been someone else entirely, given a name that my father had erased and I sat there trembling, the record shaking. The shame hit me in waves, not mine, because whatever this document meant, it was proof that something had been altered, hidden, covered up. And all those years of making me feel small, humiliated, worthless, it had been projection. They had needed me to carry their shame. Vindication flicked for the first time. Not just whispers, not just suspicions, a document. And though I didn't fully, my hands went cold. A document so shocking that I knew in that instant. Curiosity doesn't kill. It exposes what's been rotting in the dark. The document I found in the attic haunted me for days. I hid it under my mattress like contraband, pulling it out at night to reread the faded ink, the dates, the names that didn't align. It was more than just paper. It was proof that cracks ran through the story of my family, cracks my father had spent years patching over with pride and lie. And the more I stared at it, the more one truth pressed against my chest, until I couldn't stop now. Curiosity was pulling me into. I tried to ignore it, to bury myself in meaningless routine. But every quiet moment dragged me back to the same thought. My father's favoritism, my mother's silence, my brother's defensive. It all looked different now, cast in the... For years I had told myself, but what if it wasn't what if it was the injustice of it all? I thought back to every time I had my father's voice. The phrase had been a refrain he said, but now, maybe he had been clinging. Throw it at their... It lit my step to ask questions. One evening, I sat at the dinner table, the silence thick enough and I asked my father casually about the year my brother was. His fork froze halfway. His eyes flicked toward me, cold. What about it? His tone wasn't curious. It was warning. I shrugged, pretending it was nothing. I was just going through some old photos. The dates didn't make sense. His jaw tightened, and for a moment I swore the air shifted. Then, with forced calm, you must be remembering wrong. But I wasn't remembering. I had the document, and his hostility told me everything I... No. He was afraid. Suspicion deepened the next day when I tried again, this time with my mother. We were folding laundry in the living room, the TV humming in the background, when I asked about my brother's early childhood. Wasn't he sick when he was a baby? I asked, my voice casual, my eyes focused on the towel in my hand. She froze. Just for a second, but I saw it. The way her fingers stilled, the way her throat tightened before she forced a smile. All babies get sickly, almost too. Then she changed the subject, asking about my work, my friends, anything to steer me away. The more I pushed, the more defensive they became. My father snapped at me for being obsessed with the. My mother grew quieter, her eyes darting away when she mentioned my brother. And my brother himself, he changed too. At first he laughed it off, mocking me, calling me parent, but the more I asked, the more his laughter faded, replaced with short tempers, slammed doors, and muttered curses when he thought I wasn't. One night, I caught him in the kitchen, pacing while he spoke on the phone. His voice was low, urgent. "She's asking too many questions," he whispered. My blood went cold as I realized he wasn't talking. He was talking about me. The suspense of it all consumed me. I began spending nights in the attic, digging through boxes I convinced I had missed some. And each night, but one thing became clear. The truth wasn't in photos. It wasn't in whispers. It was in blood. And then the shock came. Not from the document, because one night, staring at the baptism record, I admitted aloud, I don't trust my family, trust a single word they've ever told me of. The only thing that can't lie is the sound of my own voice. But once it was spoken, I couldn't take it. My chest tightened with. If I really wanted answers, if I really wanted to tear years of lies, there was only one way to do it. Shame tried to creep, whispering that it was crossing a line no daughter should cross. But then I remembered standing in my father praised my. I remembered the birthdays where the humiliation. This wasn't my betrayal, and I had every. To my chest. For the first time, I felt like I had the upper hand. They had spent years making me doubt myself, twisting reality, burying me in silence. But now I had the power to uncover the one truth they couldn't spin away. That night, as I sat at my desk, my laptop glowing in the dark, I opened a new tab and typed the words with trembling fingers. DNA test kit. My heart pounded as I hovered over the order button. I knew the second I clicked it, there was no turning back. Sometimes the riskiest lies to uncover are the ones in your own blood. Ordering the DNA test had been the easy part. A click of a button, a plastic kit shipped in a box small enough to disappear into the folds of my purse. But the moment it arrived, wrapped in innocent packaging, reality pressed against my chest. This wasn't just curiosity anymore, it was betrayal. At least that's what I told myself as I tucked the box under, too afraid to even. The betrayal had my father's favoritism, my mother's silence, my brother's strange defense. They had built a fortress of. All I was doing now was still. The weight of guilt clung, crossing a line. You're breaking the years of being. That wasn't love. That wasn't protection. That was destruction. And if I had to cross a line to survive it, the plan was simple and collect DNA from my brother without. But execution? That was the part that kept me awake at night, my heart racing. He wasn't careless. Not the way I needed him to be. He guarded his things with an intensity that now seemed less and more like fear. His toothbrush was always put away, his laundry tossed straight into the. If he suspected. The first attempt came at a Sunday family. We were all seated around the table, smell of roasted chicken, conversation. My brother leaned back in his chair, laughing at a soda can, and I watched the rim touch his, watched the conversation drip down. My pulse thundered as he pretended to be. My hand inched, and just as I was, my mother reached, rolled into her hand instead. She laughed, wiped it with a napkin, and tossed it into the trash. My stomach plummeted as I realized how close I'd been, and how quickly it could all fall apart. Humiliation surged through me in that moment, not because anyone had caught me, but because I felt like stealing scraps of evidence, all because the truth had been denied. My hands trembled under the table, my appetite gone, but I forced myself to act like no. The second attempt, in the quiet, my brother had left a hairbrush on the blonde strand. I stared at it as, slowly, I shoved the brush back and bolted into his brows furrowed. What are you doing? Looking for the bathroom. His stare lingered, finally nodded, and I held my breath and the envelope burning. Suspense became every time I passed my brother every time my father's eyes. Nights were the worst. The explosion that was I proving them right? I pressed my hands over my, whispering into the. I'm not like them. I'm not. But doubt coiled in my chest like a snake. The shock came when I finally mailed the envelope. Standing at the post office, the package small in my hands, I felt like I was holding a live bomb. My palms were sweaty, my knees weak, and for a long moment I hesitated in line, wondering if I should turn back. But then I remembered my aunt's slip of the tongue, the document in the years of silence. I dropped it into the outgoing bin, my hands trembled. It was gone, out of my control, and the wait began. Those days dragged like years. Every time my phone buzzed, my stomach clenched. I refreshed my email obsessively, each empty inbox mocking me with silence. The suspense was unbearable, stretching me thinner with each hour. At work, I snapped at colleagues. At home, I jumped at every sound. My brother noticed too. He tilted his head one evening, studying me. "You've been acting weird lately," he said slowly. My heart nearly stopped as I forced a smile. "Just tired." He didn't press, but his eyes lingered too long, and I knew he didn't believe me. And then, when I least expected it, it happened. 10 days later, long before I thought the results could possibly arrive, my phone buzzed with my hands went cold. Shock ripped through me like lightning. Too soon, too fast. I wasn't ready. My knees buckled as I sat down on the edge, staring at the email. Might as well have been a grenade. Inside it was the truth my family had, the truth that could. My finger hovered as the room darkened around. The truth didn't just. The email glared. My breath came, my heart pounding so violently. For 10 days, preparing myself. Maybe the DNA would match. Maybe the whispers had. But now, staring at the note, I knew I was sick. My finger trembled as lines of data filled the truth of my life. Test results showed no paternal match. My brother, the golden child, the son around him, was not my father. For a long moment, I couldn't breathe. My eyes darted across. But science doesn't bend to wishes. Science doesn't care about or years of favoritism. It simply tells. And the truth was staring. The first wave that hit, my chest tightened, my stomach twisted, and I felt like the ground. All those years, every look of pride, every time every holiday ruined, circled back to the he had poured everything into a son who wasn't even him. Been left to carry the weight of invisibility. But then came something stranger. Relief. A part of me, the part that had spent years questioning why I was never enough, finally had an answer. It wasn't that I was inherently less worthy, less lovable. It was that my father's pride had been built on a lie so fragile he couldn't afford to share. All those years of humiliation hadn't been about me at all. They had been about protecting the illusion he clung to. I sat frozen. Memories, the way my mother, the way the way my aunt, my entire life had every dinner table. I too naive to anger followed. Of nights I cried, my fists clenched. The suspense of what to do. I stared at my mind spinning with questions. Should I tell my brother? Would it destroy him to? Should I confront my mother, force her to admit she'd hidden all these years? Or should I go straight to my father, the man who had built his pride on a lie and used me as collateral damage to? Every option felt dangerous, like walking into. Shock still clung to me, sharp and raw. I scrolled back through the results again, tracing the mismatched line, the undeniable absence. There was no mistake, no error. The son my father had worshipped, the one he had raised on a pedestal while I withered in his wasn't his. And suddenly, all those moments of obsessive favoritism. My father hadn't just loved my brother. He had needed him, desperately, to prove a lie he couldn't let anyone uncover. Shame tried to creep in again, whispering that maybe I was cruel for digging, cruel for wanting to expose the truth. Families survive on silence, I told myself. Maybe it would be better to leave it buried. But then I remembered the night of the family dinner, the humiliation of being mocked and dismissed while my father praised my brother in front of everyone. I remembered the way I had sat there, burning with shame, while no one defended me. If they had no mercy for me, why should I protect them now? And so the shame reversed. For the first time, I saw clearly that it wasn't mine to carry. The secret was theirs. The lie was theirs. The shame of dissent, of years of manipulation, of turning me into a scapegoat. It belonged to them, not me. My only crime had been surviving it long enough to see. Vindication began. I wasn't jealous. I had been right. Something was wrong, and now I had proof that could no longer be denied, no matter how much they tried. Proof that could finally force. But triumph was still to reclaim my. And that thought both exhilaration. The question now wasn't, or would I do it, forcing the entire family to. Either way, the moment was come. The truth was mine now, and I couldn't carry it in. As I closed the laptop, the results burned in my mind. Undeniable. My father's pride was built on lies. Carrying the truth is heavier than carrying a lie. The results sat like a stone in my chest, pressing against my lungs with every breath. I thought uncovering the truth would free me, that finally having proof would feel like cutting chains from my wrists. But it didn't. Instead, it felt like those chains had only grown heavier, their weight multiplied by the responsibility of knowing. Truth doesn't always liberate, sometimes it suffocates. At night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, the words of the DNA report replaying in my head until I could almost see the mismatched markers flashing like neon signs. No paternal match. 3 words that had changed everything. I closed my eyes and imagined my brothers, my mothers, and wondered what would happen when they would it destroy them? Would it destroy me? Sleep became my mind looped through every possible like a cruel reel. I imagined my brother's confusion. I imagined my mother's, her silent shadow, and most of all, his anger turned me for daring to the injustice of it, all while I thought of the countless times, the way he made now, knowing what I knew, every memory felt. He hadn't just failed. My pain was collateral damage. I saw myself while my father barely looked. I saw myself at birthday, the cake candles. I saw myself silenced, humiliated. Your brother's the one. All of it, every wound. Anger pulsed, unaware that his every word of praise to throw the immediacy. The truth demanded precision. Suspicion bled into strategy. I watched my father more closely, listened to his words with sharper ears. He praised my brother constantly, almost obsessively, as though affirming him in front of others could hold the lie together a little. My brother basked in it, oblivious, defensive whenever I so much as hinted at. And my mother, her silence had grown heavier, her eyes darting whenever his rehearsed speech. It was as though she too felt the suspense gnawed at me. Every family dinner, every casual gathering, I carried the results folded in their weight tangible. But silence was the truth pressed harder, and I knew I couldn't. Shock still rippled through. Sometimes I'd glance at the familiar features of the boy and the thought would slam. He isn't who you think he is. Not in the way you've been told. It wasn't his fault. He hadn't asked to be born into a web of lies. But still, it unsettled me. Every smile, every laugh, every memory suddenly felt colored by a truth shame tried to sneak back in, whispering that maybe I was cruel for wanting to expose it. Maybe I was destroyed. Families survive because of silence, don't they? That's what I'd been taught all my life, to swallow my pain, to carry burdens that weren't mine, to accept invisibility for the sake of peace built on lies isn't peace, it's bondage. And I was done being vindication slowly replaced. For years they had dismissed me. They had painted me as bitter, unstable, anything to keep. But now I had proof that I was, proof that the pedestal was, proof that the truth, no matter how, was mine to tell. And holding that proof, but triumph was still the results alone. The real triumph would come when I shattered the sight. The question was no longer if I would, it was when. And then the decision crystallized. It couldn't be in private, not one-on-one, where my father could dismiss me, call me unstable, not whispered in corner where the truth could be number. The reveal had to be public, undeniable, the same way if he could strip me bare, and it was only fitting, a family event. Soon, a reunion, the kind where relatives filled the room, laughter mingled with gossip, and stories were retold for the 100th time. I could already picture it, my father boasting about my brother, my relatives nodding in agreement, the familiar pattern repeating itself. Only this time I wouldn't sit silent. This time I would rise. As I folded the results back into my notebook and slid it into my bag, I whispered to myself, the next family gathering won't just be a reunion, it will be the reckoning. They planned a party for pride, but it became a stage for destruction. The invitation had been mailed weeks in advance, glossy paper embossed with gold lettering, a celebration of achievement. My father's handwriting scrawled across the bottom, almost smug. You'll be there. Of course I would be. These gatherings weren't optional, not in our family. They were rituals, ceremonies meant to polish my brother's crown, while reminding me that I was little more than I knew exactly what another shrine to my brother, another night where my father's booming voice filled the room with another relatives. Only this time, when I arrived at the banquet, the air was already thick. A giant photo of him, tables glittered with silverware and champagne, the scent of roast beef and buttered rolls. It looked like a wedding reception, but it was a coronation, and my father was the king. Shame hit me first, as it always did. It didn't matter that I carried the DNA results in my bag like a sword waiting to be. The moment I walked into that room and heard my relatives laugh, the memories came. Birthdays were my brother, holidays where my father told everyone, as though I was, and sure enough, betrayal followed. My father spotted me at the back and raised, not like her brother, always on time, always dependable. But she's here. At least laughter erupted, light-hearted to them, but sharp as knives to me. My cheeks burned. Even tonight, even with my silence and he couldn't resist turning. Humiliation settled. Guests nodded knowingly. They didn't see the wound he reopened. They only saw the proud, the golden son. Daughter who never measured up. And my father thrived on it, feeding off the applause, his chest swelling as he spoke louder, boasting about my brother's hard work, discipline, and talent. But this time, anger didn't make me collapse. It steadied me. Every cruel word, every slight disguised as humor, every dismissal fueled the fire burning in my chest. I kept my eyes lowered, my lips pressed together, hiding the storm. He thought my silence meant defeat, but in truth, it was preparation. Suspicion tugged at me again, even as I listened to him. For years, I had doubted his motives, doubted the stories that didn't quite fit, doubted the history that seemed rehearsed, and now I knew why. His pride wasn't just about it was about covering a truth that threatened to unravel him. Tonight, that truth was sitting in my bag, folded neatly on crisp paper. The suspense was the room blurred. The results had been undeniable, but part of me still reeled. My brother wasn't who it had been built on a lie, and yet here we were, still playing him the king, my brother the prince, me the forgotten. I almost laughed at tonight the script would find. Shame tried once more. What if they called me bitter? What if they accused me of fabricating what if I ended up humiliated? My voice drowned out by the fear pressed heavy on my chest, the old instinct. But then I remembered the hallway the laughter, remembered the night I whispering to myself that that memory burned my hands steady. Tonight their triumph felt like the faint rumble of my father's words, but I no longer flinched. Instead, I had ignored me, the ones who had pitied me. I imagined their expressions when the truth landed like a thunderbolt, when the pedestal they had built crumbled in front of them. The thought steadied me, strengthened me, made me certain that tonight was The applause rose as my father raised his glass again, his voice booming with pride. To my son, the best of us, the pride of this family, the future we can all look up to. The cheers echoed through the hall, glasses clinked, laughter filled the air, and in that moment I pushed my chair back slowly. The sound of its leg, heads turned, my father paused, glass still raised, eyes narrowing. My mother stiffened. My brother smirked, confident in the book, but I stood tall. As the gas spread through I held the DNA. They humiliated, so I destroyed them with. The envelope trembled slightly but my voice didn't. Not anymore. For the first time in my life, stronger than the whispers, stronger than the comparison, stronger than the weight of my father's party for my brother had been meant as a coronation of his golden son. But the second I unfolded the papers, I knew I was about to turn it into, and the truth was about to be I lifted the first page, my eyes scanning the familiar words, the lines I had memorized. I didn't scream. I didn't stumble. I read the results as though the DNA test shows isn't my father's. The words hung in the air like smoke for a heartbeat. No one moved. The silence was thick, suffocating it. Then came the gasp, sharp, shocked, disbelieving. Forks clattered against plates. Glasses froze midair. Conversation stuttered and just like that, my brother's face, his confidence, collapsed into something brittle and his jaw tightened, his eyes darting for the first time as a man trapped, red, his veins standing out against his temples. He sat frozen, his champagne glass trembling in his hand, the pride he had boasted only seconds before dissolving into disbelief. His lips parted, but no words came. His pride, the very thing that had been weaponized against me my whole life, was crumbling in front of everyone. The room erupted with whispers. What does she mean? Is that true? How could this be? Relatives leaned across tables, their voices hushed, yet some stared at me and more still at my father, waiting for him to save the family from this wreckage. But no one saved anything. The injustice of it all. For years I had, but this time, my father shifted, his eyes burning, his silence louder. My brother sat, his hands gripping, and the relatives who had once laughed, their eyes wide. For the first time, the humiliation, anger burned through me. Not reckless, but this was what I had carried alone for so long, what I had been gaslit into. This was why my father's favoritism, somewhere in the or chosen not. My anger wasn't just, but for the willful blindness that while protecting my suspicion spread through the room. Relatives turned to each other, calling past and whispered stories, moments that in his birthday time. Remember when your aunt? The whispers grew, building, feeding off each other. The lie wasn't just exposed, it was unraveling in real. The suspense was unbearable. My father still hadn't spoken. His hands clenched the tablecloth, his jaw set, his eyes locked on my brother with a fury I had never seen before. My mother sat stiff, together so tightly, the room seemed to shrink, the air thick with everyone waiting. Father finally rose from his chair, his voice low but dangerous. Is this true? He demanded, the words cutting through the room like a blade. His gaze wasn't on me, it was on my brother. For the first time in my life, his eyes weren't filled with pride when he looked at him. They were filled with suspicion. My brother opened his mouth, but no words came out. He glanced at me, then at the papers still in my hand, then back at my father. His face was pale, his confidence shattered. The golden boy, the favored son, the man who had been praised his entire life, was silent, and in that silence, the entire family knew. Shame rippled across the room, settling like a fog. But again, it wasn't mine. It was theirs. My father's, theirs for building a pedestal on lies, theirs for humiliating me while worshiping a false image, theirs for sacrificing me to protect their pride. And now, with the truth blazing in the, they had nowhere left to. Vindication surged through me, stronger than I had ever felt. I stood taller, my voice steady. This isn't a mistake. This isn't a rumor. This is science, and it proves what I've suspected all along, that the family you put on a pedestal was built on lies. My relatives stared at me differently, not as the invisible daughter, not as a scapegoat, but as the woman who had finally shattered the silence. My father's face twisted. My brother's shoulders slumped. For once, it wasn't mine to bear. I looked directly at my father, meeting his stunned gaze with a, you wanted to you wanted me, but the truth doesn't stay. Tonight, it's your turn to face it. The room buzzed, questions spilling out than anyone could answer. Who is his real father? How long has this been hidden? The banquet hall that had once been a shrine to my every relative, every whisper another crack in their constructed facade. And then, just as the noise reached it, my father slammed his fist on his voice booming, explain yourself. The entire room, knowing the real storm was. Cornered men don't confess, they lash out. Cornered men don't confess, they lash out. I felt the truth of that line like a pulse in my throat as the banquet hall stilled around my father's command. His roar, explain yourself, was still lodged in the chandelier crystals, trembling in the air with the clink of glass that hadn't quite settled. Every head had turned toward my brother, the golden sun framed in the glow of a party that had been built like a monument to him. For years he'd been praised for, applauded for standing in a room, treated like gravity, but now gravity was indifferent, and his chair seemed to tilt under. He stared at the DNA paper, as if ink. He swallowed and tried to lift his chin, but the movement stalled midway, a gesture had already defeated. This is ridiculous, and his voice broke on the syllable so slightly that only those of us. The break seemed to give him permission. You think anyone here believes you? You forged those. You always wanted to tear me down because you couldn't stand that Dad saw me, that everything about me is. He said it fast. Words stature in front of a door. He pointed at me, and I felt the old choreo. Me shrinking, him swelling, but the rhythm had gone. The dance steps no longer fit the music. I raised the envelope, not like a weapon, not the way a doctor might raise an ex. It's notarized, tested twice, chain of custody document. I can list the dates if you need more time to adjust to facts. My voice surprised me with its steadiness, as if a court reporter had seized my vocal cords and refused to indulge in melodrama. That calm made him angry. His cheeks burned, his jaw worked, an ugly brittle sound, the kind that rattled. Of course you come to my party to pull this stunt, he said. You couldn't stand one single night where you. Before I could answer, the room began to hum, a low electricity flickering through. Families are chorus lines. Everyone knows the steps. Didn't she say the results were verified? He never did look like him. Another voice confessed, suddenly emboldened by the cover of an aunt who had once tutted at my clothes, leaned forward and remember that slip, the timing that never made. The whispers weren't knives, they were mirrors, and my brother saw himself. 1. He slammed his palm onto the white linen as if volume could banish reflection. Forks jumped, and several glasses chimed with the shuddering note of a warning bell that no one heeded. My father had been coiled in his chair like a trap that hadn't decided which direction. The tremor in his champagne glass had turned into a rattle against crystal, then a quiet ring as he set it down with surgical precision. He stood, slow as a tower, and his shadow draped across like a curtain. Don't talk to me about stunts, he said to my brother, and there was a terrible dignity to the way he said it, the tone of a man who believed himself carved from granite and has just heard the first pebble hit the floor. Answer the question she put in the air. Are you my son? The last 3 words carried too much history to be spoken softly. They trailed all the nights he had bragged, all the trophies he'd thrust forward on, all the judgments he'd passed over me like. It wasn't a query, it was a verdict hunting. My brother took a breath and then mistook indignation. I am your son because you raised me, because we're family, because blood isn't everything. His voice tried to sound noble, but nobility doesn't sweat that hard, and the sweat beating at his hair. He pivoted, almost. She wants to erase me to herself look like us. She's been nursing a grudge since. Now she found some quack to print her a fantasy and dragged it into a celebration. He gestured toward me with a flourish that had worked 100. The invitation for us to flow downhill, but sympathy had grown suspicious. The tide didn't move. Cousins who used to roll their eyes were suddenly watching me like I might be the only thing in the room. An uncle tugged at his collar, heat prickling his cheek. He should be begging for a third test right. A woman said, and the logic landed like a stone dropped into still water, sending rings outward. My father's raft of pride upended, and beneath it was expert on his anger. Tonight he stood between those extremes like a man deciding which. If there is a lie here, he continued, voice rising, I will find it and burn it down, but you will not hide behind her as a smokescreen. The last word cracked like a whip. For a second my brother looked 10 years old and afraid of thunder. Then he remembered the crowd and shook the fear off like rain. He turned on me with a desperation that made his posture ugly. You always did want to make Dad choose, and there it was. The theology of favoritism that had governed our house. Love was rationed like wartime sugar. Every spoonful for him had been taken from me. You couldn't stand it when I won, so you built this circuit. You want to watch him humiliate me. I should have thrown back a sharper retort, something that would sting without drawing blood. But I found myself speaking from, I didn't build anything. You all did. You built a pedestal and called it family. You built a myth and called it love. I just turned on the light. The sentence wasn't loud, but it traveled, and I watched people receive it with anger begets, and my father's finally detonated. He pounded the table with silverware jump. Enough, he barked, not even at the relic, but at a universe. That last word, we were in a rented hall dressed as the slippage was ever, the king without a castle, a father without an heir, a man facing dawn. The relatives who had begun the evening found themselves as jurors in a trial. None of them were. Shame walked the aisles like a server balance. It touched shoulders in the shame of having laughed, the shame of having praised my brother, the shame of having worshipped my people averted their eyes, not as an act of pride. It was easier to stare into the frosting. A cousin finally spoke up, gentler than I. If it's not true, she said to my brother, tell us you want another test. Tell us you'll take one tomorrow. Say you'll clear this up. He rushed to nod, then paused, as if the word tomorrow had. Hesitation is louder than refusal when distrust has. The pause stretched a beat, caught himself and said, fine, of course. We'll test again. But the sentence came out as a plea rather than a promise. And please don't steady a room the way promises do. My father closed his eyes as if he could force equilibrium back the way you might. Underneath the fury, my brother's life had been built on and clarity arrived. It does not ask permission. Aunties from opposite sides. Someone brought up and once a story finds, it refuses to go back in. My brother tried to seize the pen, but kept dropping it, blaming me. He could not make the room forget. Heat in the room rose, and for the first time since the reveal, she hadn't moved much. Her mouth was, she was listening not to the words. He shouted down 3, is this what you, he made this sound like what I wanted. You built me a gallery of kind that clarifies more than it condemns. He stared at me, and for a heartbeat I saw him see me. The moment passed, but it had existed, and I stored it like a pearl. The argument broke into factions the way floods divide a landscape, carving new channels where the ground was already soft. A pocket of relatives drifted toward my brother with consolations fashioned out of habit rather than conviction. Another cluster drifted toward me, not with applause, but with that attentive quiet people give a witness who has earned the stand. Between those groups, my father strode like a general on a field he no longer recognized, rallying troops that no longer recognized. The music from the hired quartet had long since, but I could still hear the ghost of it. A waltz refusing to admit the room had shifted into testimony. It happened quickly and then felt inevitable. My mother stood. No one noticed at first because she was not noisy. She rose like a and once upright, not because she lacked, because the memory of all the rooms she had. She placed one hand on the back, then lifted it. Stop, and the word was not loud. Conversations halted mid-syllable, like actors missing their. My father pivoted toward fusion cutting through his. My brother's face turned all at once. I watched my mother. Her eyes found mine briefly, a glance that wasn't apology so much as a quick acknowledgement that I had been living in the unswept. There's something I need to say, and even the air seemed to lean. I understood then that denial, which had strutted through the room in one costume, indignation, accusation, had reached its. What was coming would not be a correction, it would be a redefinition. My father took a step forward, then back, as if his legs no longer trusted the My brother swallowed hard enough that the sound felt audible. A small percussion. The relatives' faces lit. hope and dread. While dreading the work those mother's fingers a nervous I thought of all the injustice had been tidied into a virtue called discipline, where humiliation had been dressed as a joke that I was told to take better. I remembered the quiet hours after those nights, when anger came like a tide and receded, leaving suspicion behind like salt on the shore. I remembered the suspense of waiting for a day that would never come on its own, and deciding to build it myself from appointment times, in lab forms, in the discipline of not shaking. Shame had wandered the room tonight, and it had finally grown weary of knocking on the vindication wasn't joy, it was breath, deep and clean. My mother inhaled, as if drawing courage up from the floor. She looked at my father like a person about to tell, I can't let this, and the words were, it's time you all heard the truth. Then she spoke the first name. The truth doesn't just destroy, it burns down the wall. The silence afterwards was so complete, felt unnatural, as though the very air, her voice had been bubbling of a dam straits of pressure. But even he didn't. He knew. Deep down, my mother drew in a breath. Her words carried the weight of betrayal long buried, not by blood, not by truth. He was born of a mistake, of betrayal I thought I could bear. The gasp that spread through the room was horror. Relatives clutched. Slow motion. My father's face drained of color, and for the first time, the mighty man who had towered over me my whole life looked small. His lips parted, but no words came. My brother's head jerked toward our mother, his mouth hanging open in silent protest. His hands gripped the tablecloth so tightly that his knuckles whitened, as though he could anchor himself to something solid while the ground crumbled beneath. Mom, he choked out, his voice cracking, almost childish. That's not true. Tell them it's not true. But my mother didn't flinch. Her eyes, red with tears, stayed on my. It was before the marriage was even a year old, she said, her voice quivering. I was young, reckless. I thought it would never matter. But if I raised him as yours, if I gave you the perfect son you want, it would heal the cracks in our. Her words grew steadier with each confession, as though decades of silence. But the truth doesn't stay buried. It rots. And tonight it's rotted all the way to the. The banquet hall was no longer a celebration. It had become a funeral, and the corpse laid bare was not a person, but the image of perfection. His chest heaved, his hands shaking at him. For years he had wielded pride, cutting me down with every cruel dismissal, every moment of favoritism that declared me less. And now that pride had collapsed in front of the very people. My father staggered back, his hand reaching, broken in. The words weren't. His voice cracked. The room erupted into some demanding answer. A cousin stood and openly into her nap. Others shook their heads, murmuring prayer as though faith. The sound rose into a, and through it all, my brother's voice. This doesn't change anything, he cried, his voice break. Dad, I'm still your son. I'm still the one you raised, the one you loved. He pushed himself to his face pale. You can't just erase me. His words were frantic, spilling from his mouth like water from a. But no one reached for. No one offered comfort. Who had once lifted him high on a pedestal now stared at him as though he were a stranger, their eyes cold with judgment. My father turned on him, and for the first time in my life, his gaze on my brother wasn't filled with pride. It was filled with disgust. You are not my son, he spat, the venom in his words echoed. My brother flinched, his face twisting with his hands shaking as though he could physically grasp the identity slipping from him. The humiliation was complete. The pedestal had crumbled into. Tears streamed down my mother's face as she tried to step. Please don't do this, she begged, her voice breaking. He may not be yours by blood, but you raised him, you. Love? My father's roar silent. You think this is love? You gave me a lie and called it love. You gave me a bastard and made me worship, while you destroyed the daughter. His voice broke into a ragged. You've ruined everything. The words hit me. For years I had been erased, belittled, treated like a and now, in front of everyone, he had chosen him over. He had destroyed me to protect a. My chest tightened, but instead of breaking, I stood taller. The tears that forgotten daughter, and the room spun wing, whispers. Some relatives were, and then, in the middle of the chaos, it wasn't the. He looked at me as the daughter he had humiliated, crushed beneath, stood tall. The DNA papers still clutched in my chin lifted. For once, I didn't feel small under. I didn't feel, and it was almost more overwhelming. All the years of his voice broke. Daughter. And in that shattered moment, I knew everything was about to change forever. In the ruins of their pride, I found my freedom. The air after the collapse felt different, lighter, thinner, as if the walls that had caged me for so long had finally given way. The banquet hall was no longer a shrine, no longer a courtroom. It was a ruin, the aftermath of a truth detonation that had left nothing standing in it. Chairs sat askew, glasses half drained, and relatives scattered, but I felt none of the shame that used. In the ruins of their pride, I found something. For years, favoritism, though it always poisoned. My brother had been exalted while my father's praise had been a currency that my role was that injustice. It had taught me that my worth was in the wreckage of. I finally understood. Injustice can never survive. It may linger, but truth eventually. The humiliation. My brother sobbed quiet. No longer the never dared to look for, and I didn't need to. But in that moment, suspicion had haunted me. But tonight, the suspense of my and clarity as the shock of my mother's confession still rippled through the room like an aftershock from an earthquake. People whispered the name she had spoken, repeating it like a forbidden prayer, connecting timelines and secrets in their heads. But that shock no longer belonged to me. For once I wasn't the one stunned, silenced, or cornered. I was the one standing tall in the eye of the storm. Shame, my old companion, had shifted too. I had carried it for so long that it felt almost. But as I stood in that hall, I realized shame had never belonged. It had been forced onto me, planted in my hands like a burden I was. Tonight I set it down. Tonight it returned to the people, and then came vindication. Not the petty kind, not the shallow satisfaction, but the deep, resounding vindication had survived the imp and stood taller. Vindication is not about, it is about the girl, about the daughter who, about the woman who, my father's eyes, a glance from him. But now, there was something in brokenness? Yes, but also recognition. For the first time, he saw me not as an inconvenience, not as a disappointment, but as his daughter. The sound was raw, stripped of pride, stripped of judgment. It was the voice of a man who had, and finally, in that moment, justice doesn't always look. Sometimes justice is simply the truth being seen, the lies being stripped, the scales balancing in the. I didn't need my father's tears or my brother's or my mother's shame. The truth had already done that. But hearing those words from his, broken though they were, felt like a door finally opened. Now looked at me. Some looked away. Others stared at me. A few even looked guilty. But none of that mattered. Own skin. For the first time, I wasn't shrinking. I wasn't hiding. I wasn't begging to be. I was simply standing, and that was enough. In the days and weeks that followed, the fallout rippled through our family like aftershock. Relationships cracked and others clung to rebuild something. My brother drifted into no longer the center of attention, struggling to. My mother carried her guilt like a trying to apologize but never finding words. And my father changed. He was quieter, less certain, stripped of the arrogance that had once been his. But in his brokenness, he began to reach tentative words, small gestures. For once he tried, and I, finally, was free. Free from the cycle of favoritism, free from the injustice that had stolen my voice, free from the humiliation that had shaped my, free from the anger that had free from the suspicion, free from the suspense of waiting for it already knew, free from the shock of betrayal, free from the shame that was never mine, free because vindication. I walked forward into my life with a new certainty. I was no longer the invisible dog. Every scar, every wound, but in the end, if this story, have you ever felt in, share this video.